My name is Trevor Morrison. I'm 34 now, but this happened back in 2018. I still think about it every few days, especially when I try to sleep. I had taken time off from my job at the time. I was working in an auto repair shop in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I didn't really have much planned that summer, but I wanted to get away from people for a while. Too much noise, too much work, too many people talking all the time. I didn't want to fly anywhere or stay at a hotel. I just wanted to disappear into the woods for a few days. I thought I could recharge. I didn't realize it would become the most disturbing experience of my life. I drove out to Arkansas toward the Ouachita Mountains. I had done a bit of backpacking before, nothing serious, but I knew how to set up a camp, build a fire, and all that. I picked a less popular trail, one of those that wasn't on the main websites, something I found through an old post on a camping forum. There were directions to a small clearing off a dirt road, then about a mile or two of hiking to a spot near a stream. The guy who posted it said it was peaceful and quiet. That was exactly what I wanted. I wrote the directions down, printed a map, and packed up for a 4-day solo camping trip. I didn't tell many people where I was going, just my coworker, Mark, and I told him I'd be back by Monday. I left early on a Friday morning. The drive took about 4 hours, including a stop for gas and some extra supplies. I had a cooler with food, water, snacks, and a few beers. I brought a 9mm handgun with me too. I always took it when I camped alone. Not because I was scared, but more out of habit. I wasn't expecting anything worse than maybe a snake or a raccoon. By the time I got to the trailhead, it was just past noon. It was a rough dirt road, barely wide enough for my truck, and it felt like it hadn't been used in a while. Weeds were growing right down the middle, and there were branches scraping the sides of the truck. I parked under some tall pine trees, far from any sign of civilization. There was no one else around, no cars, no buildings, not even a fence. I put on my pack, locked the truck, and started walking. The trail was narrow, more like a deer path than a real trail. It wound through thick woods with pine needles and leaves covering most of the ground. I had to duck under low branches and step over rotting logs. Every so often, I'd see a small orange marker nailed to a tree, probably put there by some hunter or an old hiker group, but they were faded and far apart. It took me about 45 minutes to get to the spot. It was even better than I expected. There was a wide clearing by a stream, with enough flat ground for a tent and a fire. The trees formed a natural barrier around the space, and the sound of the water was calm and steady. I set up my tent facing the stream, laid out my gear, and built a small fire pit with rocks I found nearby. The sun was still up, but the shadows from the trees made it feel like late afternoon. I cooked some hot dogs on a small grill I brought, cracked open a beer, and sat on a log I dragged over near the fire. I didn't see or hear anyone else the entire time. No hikers, no campers, nothing. Just birds, wind, and the occasional splash of a fish in the stream. That first night was uneventful. I stayed up late, watching the fire and staring at the stars. When I crawled into my tent, it was quiet and cool. I fell asleep fast. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of something moving. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, like footsteps. I lay still, listening, not sure if I had imagined it. The steps were soft but heavy, not an animal scurrying, something bigger. I reached over and slowly unzipped my pack, feeling for the gun. I waited. After about a minute, the steps faded away. I didn't hear anything else. I stayed awake for another hour, just listening, but nothing came back. The next morning, I got out and looked around. There weren't any footprints I could see. Maybe it had been a deer, maybe a bear. Either way, it didn't mess with my camp. Everything was still in place. I had breakfast, did some light fishing in the stream, and took a nap in the afternoon. Around 4 p.m., I heard something again. This time, it was the sound of a branch breaking. Not just a crack, but a loud snap, like someone stepping on it with force. I stood up fast, looking toward the trees. I didn't see anything, but the sound was close, maybe 30 or 40 feet into the woods. I called out, thinking maybe someone had stumbled onto my camp. No one answered. I stayed alert for a while, watching that part of the woods, but nothing moved. I didn't hear anything else after that, so I chalked it up to another animal. Still, that night, I kept the fire going longer. I sat with the gun next to me, just in case. Around 10 p.m., I thought I saw movement in the trees again. Not something big, but like a shadow shifting between trunks. I got up and shone my flashlight around the perimeter. Nothing. The woods swallowed up the light a few feet in. I was tired, but I couldn't relax. I didn't sleep as well that night. Every small sound made me tense up. The third day was overcast and humid. I felt uneasy from the moment I woke up. It was like something was off, but I couldn't say what. The woods were too quiet. Even the birds weren't making much noise. Around noon, I decided I'd pack up the next morning instead of staying a full 4 days. I didn't feel good about the place anymore. That evening, I went to gather more firewood. I walked farther than usual, maybe 200 feet from my camp, following a line of fallen trees. That's when I found it. A pile of trash, half buried under leaves and branches. Old beer cans, a torn-up sleeping bag, wrappers, and a rusted cooking pot. There were boot prints nearby, too, not fresh but not old either. I crouched down and poked around with a stick. Some of the trash was damp, but some of it looked recently used. There was even a plastic water bottle with condensation still inside. I froze. Someone else had been camping out here recently, and they hadn't cleaned up. I backed away and returned to my camp fast, checking to see if anything had been touched. Nothing was missing, but I suddenly felt exposed. That night, I didn't make a fire. I didn't cook anything. I sat in the dark, holding my flashlight and my gun, listening to the woods. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, this time closer, much closer, and then a soft metallic clink, like something brushing against metal. I stayed inside the tent, my heart pounding so loud I could feel it in my ears. The steps circled around the tent slowly. I could barely breathe. Then silence. I don't know how long I waited. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour. I didn't move. I didn't sleep at all. To first light, I packed everything up. I didn't even bother eating. I stuffed the tent, the gear, everything into my backpack and got moving. As I reached the start of the trail, I found something that stopped me cold. A shoe print in the mud, headed in the direction of my camp. Not mine. Too large, and fresher than the ones I saw earlier. I didn't stop walking until I saw my truck. I unlocked it, threw everything in the back, and drove out of there without looking back. I didn't calm down until I was back on a paved road. When I got home, I tried to explain it to myself. Maybe some squatter had been living out there. Maybe a hunter had wandered through. But the way those footsteps circled my tent, the way someone stayed out there without showing themselves, the trash pile, the silence, none of it sat right with me. Someone had been out there watching me. Someone who didn't want me to see them. I never reported it. I didn't have any proof. No one had technically done anything. But I never went camping alone again after that. And I always tell people, if you think you're alone out in the woods, you're probably wrong. Because someone knew I was out there. They watched me and they waited. And I still don't know what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. I don't usually go camping alone, but that summer I needed to get away from everything. I'd been stuck in the same daily routine for what felt like years. Wake up, sit through traffic, stare at a screen for 8 hours, come home, repeat. My job in Denver was steady but numbing. At 33, I was in that gray area where I wasn't sure what I was working toward anymore. My friends were all either married with kids or grinding even harder in their careers. I felt stuck between both worlds, so I figured a few days out in nature could clear my head. I chose a spot in southwestern Wyoming, just inside the Bridger-Teton National Forest. I didn't want anything commercial or crowded, just a place I could hike into and set up on my own. No cell service, no people, just trees, mountains, maybe a few deer if I got lucky. I parked my car off a gravel service road that I'd marked on my map earlier, locked everything inside the trunk except what I'd carry in my backpack, and started hiking around 10 in the morning. The sun was already warming up the air, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. The trail wasn't even a real trail, just an old, washed-out logging path that curved through dense pine forests and rolled over soft hills. It felt remote enough to keep other people away, but not so deep I'd get lost. I had a compass, an actual printed topo map, and extra batteries for my flashlight. I wasn't reckless, I just wanted solitude. By early afternoon, I'd gone about 4 miles in and found a clearing not far from a slow-moving creek. It wasn't wide, maybe the size of a basketball court, surrounded by thick pine on all sides with soft moss underfoot. You could barely see the sky from there, just bits of blue between the treetops. It felt protected, like a pocket hidden from the rest of the world. I pitched my tent under the shade, collected a bit of dry wood from the forest floor, and made a fire ring with stones. I boiled water for coffee using my little backpacking stove and sat on a log, letting the quiet settle in. There was nothing but the soft crack of branches in the breeze and the occasional rustle of squirrels. That first night, I didn't even light the fire. I ate some jerky, took a few notes in my journal, and climbed into my sleeping bag as the sky turned purple. But I barely slept. There's something about the woods at night when you're completely alone. Every sound feels amplified. Wind through the trees becomes footsteps. A snapping twig feels like a footfall. A screeching owl sounds like something dying. I had to keep reminding myself it was just nature doing its thing. Still, I slept with my flashlight in one hand and a knife tucked under the flap of my sleeping bag. The next morning, I got up at dawn, made instant oatmeal, and decided to do some exploring. I didn't want to go too far, just stretch my legs and see what was around. About a quarter mile west of camp, I came across an overgrown path that curved sharply downhill. It wasn't marked on my map, but it looked like it had been used at some point. Probably an old fire road or game trail. I followed it downhill for maybe 10 minutes until I noticed a faint smell. Something sour, like rotting food. I stopped and looked around, thinking maybe a raccoon or something had died nearby. The smell wasn't overwhelming, but it was sharp enough to stand out. I moved forward slowly, the air getting thicker with that scent the farther I went. It was the kind of smell you can feel in the back of your throat. 100 feet farther down the slope, the trees opened up into a narrow ravine. There was a rocky outcrop on one side and what looked like a flattened area covered with pine needles and leaves. Then I saw it. First, it looked like a pile of dirty clothes lying in the brush. Torn jeans, a gray hoodie twisted at the midsection. But something about the way it was positioned felt off, unnaturally stiff. I stepped closer. The smell was heavy now, sickly sweet and unmistakable. It was a body, face down, legs bent at weird angles. One sneaker was missing. The skin on the arms was dark and bloated, and flies swarmed in lazy circles above it. I couldn't tell how long it had been there, but it wasn't recent. Maybe a week, maybe more. I didn't get closer than I had to. I stood there for a full minute, not moving. My heart was hammering. My ears felt hot. I kept looking around the trees like someone else might be nearby, but there was nothing, no tracks, no gear, no backpack. Just this dead body in the middle of the woods. I backed away slowly, trying not to step on anything loud. I didn't want to panic, but my brain was spinning. I didn't have service. I couldn't call for help. My car was 4 miles away. The nearest ranger station was probably 20 or 30 miles beyond that. I felt completely cut off. Back at camp, I grabbed my pack and shoved everything inside. I doused the fire pit with water even though I hadn't lit anything. Every sound in the woods now felt like something watching me. I kept looking behind me, expecting to see someone stepping through the trees. I made it back to my car in record time, barely stopping for water. The whole hike back I kept thinking, what if whoever dumped that body is still out here? What if I saw something I wasn't supposed to? What if I left prints or dropped something? When I got back to my car, I locked the doors and drove like hell down that gravel road. Once I hit cell service, I pulled over and called the county sheriff's office. I didn't even care if they thought I was crazy. I told them what I saw, gave them the GPS coordinates as best as I could, and waited there until a deputy met me at a nearby rest area. They asked me a lot of questions. What time did I find the body? Did I touch anything? Did I see any signs of a struggle? I told them everything straight. I even walked them halfway back down the trail until the terrain started to match. They said they'd take it from there and asked me to stay available if they needed more info. I drove home that night, exhausted and wired at the same time. My hands wouldn't stop shaking on the wheel. I didn't sleep when I got back to Denver. I couldn't stop thinking about the body, the way the limbs were twisted, the smell, the flies. I kept seeing it in my head. A few days later, they called me back. Turns out the body belonged to a guy named Nathan Castillo, 36 years old. Last seen in Salt Lake City about 3 weeks before I found him. He'd apparently told friends he was going on a solo camping trip, but never said where. No one reported him missing for almost 2 weeks. They think he might have been hiking and had some kind of accident. The coroner said the injuries looked consistent with a fall, broken ribs, fractured skull. But there was no way to tell for sure. The body had been exposed too long. Animals had gotten to parts of it. Still, there was no evidence of foul play.
No defensive wounds.
No sign he'd been robbed. His wallet was in his pocket. A few bills still folded up inside. It messed with me more than I thought it would. For weeks, I kept imagining myself in his place. What if I'd twisted an ankle on that slope and couldn't move? What if no one knew where I was? What if my body was left out there, face down in the pine needles, just waiting for some random hiker to find me? I didn't go camping again for a long time after that. Something about the silence felt different now. It didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the woods could swallow you up and no one would even know. But I also couldn't stop thinking about how lucky I was. If I'd hiked a different direction that day, I might never have seen him. If I'd left a day earlier or later, his body might have been washed away or buried by animals. And no one would have ever found out what happened to him. At least now, his family got to bury him. At least they got some kind of closure. Sometimes I still wonder what actually happened to him. Maybe he fell. Maybe he was running from something or someone. Maybe he just got lost and panicked and slipped. No one will ever really know. All I know is that for the rest of my life, when people talk about the peacefulness of nature or the freedom of the outdoors, I'll think about that day, about that ravine, about the stillness of the air and the stench of death hanging over the trees. And I'll remember that the woods don't care if you make it out or not. They don't mark the spot where you fall. They just keep growing. And if you're lucky, someone will be there to bring you home. Back in the fall of 2019, I took some time off work. I had just turned 32, and I'd been working nonstop since college.
No vacations. No breaks.
Just constant work in a small accounting office in Central Ohio. I wasn't burned out, but I was tired of the routine. I didn't want to travel anywhere expensive or do anything too flashy. I just wanted to be away from people for a while. I packed up my car with my tent, sleeping bag, 2 coolers full of simple food, water jugs, a small camp stove, extra batteries, a couple flashlights, a folding chair, and some paperback books. My plan was to drive out of the city and find somewhere quiet where I could just camp for a few days without having to talk to anyone. I didn't care if it was legal camping land or not. I just wanted to be alone. That probably sounds dumb now, but I was tired and just didn't want to deal with people. A friend of mine from high school had mentioned an old farm that had been left empty somewhere out in southeastern Indiana, maybe an hour or so past Brookville. He told me it was off a side road off another side road, way out there, and nobody had lived there for decades. He said he and some buddies had camped there once in high school and never got bothered. It had a few structures left behind, including a collapsed barn and what was probably the old main house. That was all I needed to hear. I dropped a pin near where I thought it was and hit the road the next morning. The drive was peaceful. I took my time, played old music, and drank coffee from a beat-up thermos. I turned off the highway onto a 2-lane back road, then turned again onto a gravel road with overgrown ditches. I passed one mailbox at the very start of the gravel, but after that, there were no signs of anyone. Just trees, brush, and silence. It took me about 20 minutes of slow driving before I saw what I was looking for. A rusted gate hanging crooked at the entrance of a driveway that was almost completely hidden by weeds. I pulled over, parked, and walked down the drive first to see if it was even worth bringing the car in. The path was bumpy but not impassable. Dead leaves crackled under my boots, and branches swiped at my shoulders as I moved. About 100 yards down the path, the trees opened into a wide, uneven clearing. It was exactly what I was hoping for. The remains of a barn stood to the left, mostly collapsed, its roof caved in and vines strangling what was left of the beams. The main house was straight ahead. It was a 2-story farmhouse, the kind you see in old movies, but it had been absolutely swallowed by time. Every window was shattered. The front steps were broken. One corner of the second floor had completely fallen in, and part of the roof was sagging like it could fall at any minute. It looked more like a giant pile of rotted boards than a house. There was a tiny tool shed near the barn that was still standing. It was a little crooked, but the door was intact and it looked dry inside. The whole place felt wrong, in that way that old forgotten places sometimes do, but I brushed it off. It was exactly what I wanted: quiet, remote, and long forgotten. I walked back to the car and drove it up slowly, bouncing over potholes and tree roots. I found a flattish spot near the edge of the clearing and set up camp about 50 feet from the house. I figured it was best to keep some distance just in case any part of it collapsed while I was sleeping. By late afternoon, I had my tent pitched, my food unpacked, and a small fire pit made from some loose bricks I found near the shed. I grilled a few hot dogs on my camp stove and sat in my folding chair with a book as the sun went down behind the trees. It got cold fast after dark. The fire helped a little, but by 9 I was zipped into my sleeping bag inside the tent, reading by flashlight. The first night passed quietly, and I slept well enough. The second day was uneventful. I walked the area a bit, being careful around the old structures. I peeked inside the farmhouse from a few feet back. Didn't go in. The floor was mostly rotted through, and you could see clear down into the basement in spots. Smelled like wet wood and old dirt. I figured animals had been living in there at some point, maybe raccoons or even coyotes. Still, there was something about the layout that made me pause. There were these gouges along the wall near the front door, like deep scrapes in the wood. Could have been from moving furniture, but they were at strange angles. I told myself it didn't matter and left it alone. Around noon, I found an old stone well out past the barn. The top was partially covered with a rusted metal grate. I tossed a rock in just to see if it still had water. Clinked off something halfway down, but I didn't hear a splash. There were small animal bones near the edge, maybe a rabbit or a squirrel. The whole thing creeped me out more than the house, so I avoided that area afterward. That night, I built another small fire and ate a can of chili. I was starting to feel a little uneasy. Not scared exactly, but that kind of feeling you get when you're alone in a place that hasn't seen people in years. I hadn't seen a single car or person since I arrived. No cell service either, which I had expected, but it still added to the isolation. Just after midnight, I woke up to a noise. Not loud, more like a sharp crunch. At first I thought maybe a branch had fallen. I stayed still and listened. Then I heard it again, closer. It sounded like someone or something walking through the clearing. The steps were slow, and they moved with intention, not like a deer or raccoon. I turned off my flashlight and stayed completely still. The steps got closer. I could hear the dry grass being flattened. Then nothing. 10 minutes passed. 20. Nothing. Eventually, I fell back asleep with my hand gripping the flashlight like a weapon. In the morning, I stepped out of the tent and looked around. Everything looked normal.
No footprints.
No damage. I checked my car, still locked. I assumed it was just an animal, maybe a big one. That third day, I wandered further into the woods behind the barn. There was a broken fence line, and beyond that, some kind of path almost completely overgrown. I followed it for maybe half a mile. It wound through thick brush until it opened into a smaller clearing that had another structure, what looked like an old livestock building or smokehouse. The air was different there, heavy, like a storm was coming, even though the sky was clear. There were broken tools in the grass, a rusted saw, a shovel with a snapped handle, and a pile of old clothing that looked like it had been there for decades. Torn flannel, a pair of jeans, boots with cracked leather. I didn't touch anything. I didn't want to. That night, the noises came back, but this time they didn't stop. I heard walking again, slow steps around the edge of the clearing. Not close enough to see clearly, but too close for comfort. I peeked through the flap of the tent and saw a shape standing near the house. It wasn't moving, just standing. I couldn't tell what it was. No flashlight, no sound, just a dark figure. I turned off my light and waited. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I peeked out, it was still there. By sunrise, it was gone. I stepped outside the tent and checked everything again. Still locked, still intact. But I found something new on the ground near the fire pit. A shoe, not mine, muddy and torn. I stared at it for a long time. It looked old, but it hadn't been there the day before. I would have seen it. It was right where I'd been sitting. That was it for me. I packed everything as fast as I could. Stuffed the tent in the trunk without folding it. Didn't even eat. Just got in the car and drove. As I backed out of the clearing, I saw movement in the rearview mirror. Someone stepping out of the doorway of the farmhouse. I didn't look back. I just kept driving until I hit pavement again and got far enough for cell service to come back. I didn't report anything. I didn't want to explain why I'd been camping on someone else's land. I didn't want to get into trouble, but I think about that place a lot. Whoever or whatever was out there had been watching me, not just walking by, watching. They knew where I was. They left things for me to find. They were trying to tell me something or scare me out, and it worked. I never went camping alone again after that. Now, 5 years later, I looked up the property out of curiosity. Turns out the land was never actually abandoned. The farmhouse had belonged to a family in the 60s, and 2 of the kids had gone missing back in 71. They searched for weeks, found nothing. The place was sold cheap in the 80s, but nobody ever moved in. It changed hands a few more times after that. Now it's listed as private property, owned by some LLC that doesn't even have a real name. No phone number, no email, just a P.O. box in Kentucky. Whoever owns it now, I hope they know what's out there. I sure do, and I'm never going back. It was July of 2016. I was 34 then, and I had taken a 2-week solo trip through the southern countryside of France. My name's Oliver, and I'm originally from northern England, but I'd been living in Marseille for about 6 years at that point, working freelance jobs, mostly photography and some light writing work for travel blogs. I'd gotten used to moving around a lot on foot or by bike. Sometimes I'd hitch rides or take the train when I needed to cover bigger distances, but most of the time, I preferred being out in the woods, walking the quiet paths and sleeping under the trees. It gave me time to think, kept my head clear. That summer, I planned to camp around the Cévennes National Park. It's a massive area with rough hills, forests, open plateaus, and winding rivers. You can walk for miles without seeing another person, especially if you get off the main trails, which I always did. I had no problem being alone for days. I liked the silence, the rhythm of moving from place to place. I kept a journal, took photos, and cooked simple meals over a small camp stove. That day, I'd hiked up through a narrow stretch of woodland just south of the Lazare department. I'd marked a small clearing on the map the night before, a little flat patch of ground surrounded by thick pine trees, far from any official campsites or even secondary trails. It looked quiet, private, perfect. I reached it in the early evening. I was tired from walking most of the day, and my shoulders were sore from the pack. The clearing wasn't large, just big enough for a one-person tent and a spot to sit. I set up camp right in the middle, facing west so I could watch the last light through the trees. There was no wind. The air was still. The woods around me were quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping birds. It wasn't exactly eerie, but it stood out to me. Normally, you'd hear at least something. I figured it was just the time of day or maybe the elevation. I laid out my gear, made a simple dinner, pasta and lentils, then jotted some notes in my journal. Just observations about the land, the trees, how dry everything felt. I didn't have a signal on my phone, which wasn't unusual out there. I usually turned it off anyway to save battery. After the sun dipped behind the hills, I crawled into the tent, zipped up, and read a bit until it got dark. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up. Not suddenly, not with panic. Just slowly opened my eyes like I hadn't really been asleep at all. Couldn't tell why. The air inside the tent was cold, colder than it had been when I'd gone to bed. I listened for a while. Nothing. No wind, no animals, not even an insect buzzing. Just silence. Then I heard a twig snap. It wasn't close. It was maybe 15, 20 meters away, but it wasn't just a random noise. It was too sharp, too clean, like someone stepped on a branch with purpose. I laid still, holding my breath. My tent's rainfly was down, so I couldn't see out, but I turned slowly and reached for the folding knife I kept near my sleeping pad. I held it in my hand and listened. I didn't hear anything else for a long time, maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10. Eventually, I relaxed a little. I figured it was an animal, probably a deer or a wild boar. They moved through the woods at night. It wasn't unusual. Still, something about the sound felt careful, measured. I must have drifted off again, because I woke up later to light. Early morning, pale sunlight coming through the trees. Everything looked normal. I got out, stretched, and walked around the edge of the clearing. No tracks, no signs of anything unusual, but something had been near the tent. I could tell by the way the needles on the ground were slightly disturbed. Not in a wide circle, but just a single narrow path, like someone had walked past, slow and deliberate, in a straight line. That stuck in my head. I tried to shrug it off. I broke camp, packed up, and headed out, sticking to a route that would bring me through a lower part of the forest near a stream where I planned to rest for lunch. I didn't see anyone that morning. No hikers, no animals, just trees and sunlight. I kept thinking about the path around the tent, the way it didn't curve or wander. It went straight past the tent, maybe only 5 meters out, like someone walked by and kept going, not stopping, not veering off, just passing through. That night, I camped near the stream, closer to a marked trail. I wanted to be near water and also near a way out just in case. Again, it was quiet, too quiet, not peaceful quiet, dead quiet, like the air itself was holding its breath. I tried not to think about it. I cooked, I wrote in my journal, I slept. In the early hours, I had a dream, or I thought it was a dream. I was standing outside the tent, barefoot, watching the trees. The moon was above the treetops, pale and still. I felt cold, and the forest felt wrong. Then I saw her, a woman. She was maybe 50 meters away, standing between two trees. I couldn't make out her face clearly, but I saw her clothes. A long gray dress, muddy at the bottom, and something over her head. Maybe a scarf, maybe tangled hair. She didn't move. She didn't look away. She just stood there, watching. I woke up inside the tent, sweating. My heart was beating fast. I sat up, unzipped the flap, and looked outside. Nothing, just trees and soft moonlight. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. Whether I had sleepwalked or hallucinated or just dreamed the whole thing, it didn't matter. I had seen her, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in those woods anymore. The next few days were harder. I started hearing more noises at night. More twigs breaking, more footsteps, always from different directions. Never close enough to see anyone, but close enough to feel watched. My sleep got worse. I stopped cooking dinner, just ate dry food so I didn't have to light a flame. I moved campsites more often, trying not to stay in one place too long. Then one afternoon, as I was hiking through a narrow gorge lined with steep pines, I came across something that stopped me cold. A pile of clothes, folded neatly on a flat rock. Women's clothes, a dress, pale blue and worn thin, laid out like someone had taken it off carefully and left it there. Next to it was a small glass jar filled with dead flowers. I didn't touch any of it. I didn't even get that close. I stood there, frozen, staring at it. Something about the way it was arranged felt deliberate, like a message or a warning. I backed away and kept moving. I hiked until the sun was nearly gone, then made camp in a small dip in the land between some boulders. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat outside the tent with my knife in my hand, waiting. Sometime after midnight, I saw her again. This time, she was closer, maybe 20 meters away, standing just past the boulders, partly hidden in the trees. I couldn't see her face, but I could feel her looking at me. Her arms were hanging loose at her sides, and her head was slightly tilted. She didn't move. She didn't blink. I didn't move either. We stayed like that for what felt like hours. Then, slowly, she turned and walked away. Not rushed, just calm, smooth steps into the trees until she disappeared. I packed up before the sun rose. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I moved quickly, hiking nonstop for nearly 8 hours, finally reaching a small road that led to a village. I stayed in a cheap room above a cafe, slept for 12 straight hours, and tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. That maybe the stress, the isolation, the lack of sleep had gotten to me. But when I checked my journal the next morning, I found something that made my skin crawl. On the last page, under my notes about the clothes on the rock, someone had written something in small, shaky letters. "She sees you." It wasn't my handwriting. I hadn't written it. I hadn't even opened the journal since the day before. I don't know when it was added. I don't know how. I left France a few days later, took a train to Lyon, then flew back to England. I stopped camping for almost 2 years. I still go outdoors now, but never alone. Never far from a road. Never without checking who's nearby. And I never write in journals anymore. Even now, almost a decade later, I still think about her. About that face I couldn't see. About the way she stood. The silence around her. The glass jar. The message. I know what I saw. I know it was real. And I know she's still out there. waiting, watching. I was 33 that year, and I'd been working a desk job for nearly a decade, customer service, mostly, staring at screens and replying to emails about shipping delays and wrong item orders. It wasn't hard, just soul-numbing. That spring, I started feeling a bit sick of everything. No big breakdown or anything, just that nagging, dull thought that life was passing me by while I sat still. So I booked a week off work, bought some gear I didn't really need, and planned a solo camping trip out to the hills near Hemlock Ridge in northern Arkansas. I'd driven through that area a couple times before, years ago, and remembered the place being quiet and green, with endless woods and not a whole lot of people. That was exactly what I wanted. It was early May. I figured the weather would be warm enough to sleep under the stars, but still cool enough to enjoy hiking during the day. I left Little Rock early one Monday morning and drove north with the back of my SUV loaded up. Tent, sleeping bag, cooler, gas stove, a couple of lanterns, and enough dried food to last me 5 days. I'd even brought one of those little folding camp toilets and biodegradable bags just to avoid dealing with random holes in the dirt. It felt like overkill at the time, but by the end, I was glad I had it. The area I'd picked to camp in wasn't part of a developed campground. I wasn't really into the idea of pitching a tent 30 feet away from someone else's RV while their kids blasted music from a Bluetooth speaker. I wanted to be alone, off the beaten trail. So I used some old Forest Service maps and picked a spot a couple miles into the woods, along an old logging road that hadn't been used in years. It ended near the base of a long, shallow ridge. From there, a narrow path went up into the trees. The higher it went, the rockier it got. Not many people hiked it anymore, at least not from that side. I parked at the end of the road and hiked about a mile up, with my tent and supplies in a backpack that probably weighed way more than it should have. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the whole area smelled like wet bark and cold earth. There were birds everywhere, and the only sounds I could hear were wind in the trees and my own footsteps crunching through the leaves. It was perfect. I set up camp on a flattish area about halfway up the ridge. The slope wasn't steep there, just a gentle rise, and there was a small break in the trees that let in a little more light. I had a view of the woods below, and through a gap in the trees, I could see part of the logging road I'd come in on. There were no tire tracks besides mine. The last time anyone had probably been through that way was months ago, maybe longer. The first 2 days were quiet. I hiked around, cooked simple meals, made a fire, read for a bit, and just let my brain go quiet for the first time in what felt like years. It rained a little on the second night, just a light sprinkle, but my tent held up fine. I stayed dry and warm and fell asleep to the sound of water tapping gently against the nylon above me. On the third day, clouds started to roll in. I checked the weather forecast on my phone, barely had any signal, but a page loaded just enough to show a severe thunderstorm warning for the region. That made me pause for a second. The clouds were darker than before, and I could smell that strange, electric scent that sometimes shows up before heavy rain. I decided to stay put anyway. I had gear that could handle storms. My tent was a good one, double-layered, waterproof, rated for bad weather. I'd staked it down well, and I'd set it up away from low ground so I wouldn't get flooded. The trees around me were tall, but not so close that one would fall on me unless something extreme happened. I felt ready. Around 5 that evening, it started coming down hard. The wind picked up fast, branches swayed, and the canopy above me shook like waves. I scrambled to put everything loose back in the tent or inside my gear bags. Rain whipped sideways. Thunder cracked sharp and loud above the ridge. I sat inside the tent with the rainfly zipped tight, headlamp on, and listened to the storm rage for hours. Around 9, the thunder died down, but the rain didn't stop, kept going steady and cold. Water streamed past my tent in little channels. I checked the corners for leaks, and everything was still dry. I laid down and tried to sleep. I didn't get much. Sometime after midnight, I heard a sound that wasn't rain. At first, I thought it was part of the storm, branches falling, maybe, but then I heard it again. It was sharper, quieter, something like the sound of metal being tapped. I sat up, heart thumping harder than it should have been. I turned off my headlamp to listen. The tent was sealed up, so I couldn't see anything outside, but the sound came again, this time closer. It was quick, like someone tapped a metal pipe once, then again. 2 soft taps, then silence. The kind of sound you almost think you imagined until you hear it again. I didn't move for at least 5 minutes. My heart was racing, but I told myself it had to be something stupid. Rocks sliding, maybe a deer stepping on a can or old junk left behind. But it didn't feel like that. I knew what forest sounds were like. I'd heard plenty of raccoons and squirrels and even deer stepping through leaves. This felt different. When I finally worked up the nerve to unzip the door a little and peek out with my flashlight, I didn't see anything. Just trees and rain and darkness. I stepped out, slowly, and turned the light in a full circle. Nothing. I checked around the camp just to be sure. No tracks, no signs of anything having been there. I was soaked by the time I got back inside the tent, and my hands were shaking. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. The next morning, everything was drenched. My boots were wet. My jacket was wet. I ate a granola bar in silence and didn't even make coffee. I just sat there and thought about that sound. 2 taps, metal on metal, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't been random. I packed up most of my gear by noon. I wasn't planning to leave early, but something felt wrong. The storm had eased into light rain again, and though the sky was still gray, the worst of it had passed. I figured I could hike back down to the road and sleep in the SUV for the night. But as I was taking down the tent, I saw something. About 20 feet away, off the side of the path where I hadn't looked closely before, I noticed what looked like an old trail marker nailed to a tree. It was rusty, half buried in moss, and didn't look like any official marker I'd seen before. Just a thin strip of metal square, no writing on it. It was bent, like something had hit it or pulled at it. I walked over to check it out, and when I stepped around the tree, I saw what I thought was a pile of old wood. It wasn't. It was a homemade hunting blind, half collapsed, covered in brush. Old tarps, sticks, and what looked like chicken wire. Someone had built it to blend in. It was crude but functional. A small hole in the front for viewing. Inside was a broken lawn chair, some old plastic wrappers, and a beer can. None of it looked fresh, maybe a year old. But then I noticed the ground nearby was disturbed. Mud churned up. Someone had been standing there recently, and in the mud, I saw the faint outline of a boot print. Big, deep. It wasn't mine. That shook me a little. The whole point of picking this ridge was that nobody came out here. I'd seen no signs of anyone for miles, and now I had evidence that someone had not only been here recently, but had watched from a blind, hidden in the woods less than 30 feet from my tent. I packed the rest of my gear in a panic. I didn't even roll the tent properly, just shoved it in the bag. My hands were clumsy, cold. Every sound in the forest made me flinch. A squirrel jumping from a branch made me stumble backward. I was completely on edge. I hiked down with the rain still falling lightly. The trail was slick and I nearly slipped twice. I kept turning around, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was no one. When I reached the SUV, I unlocked it fast, tossed my gear in, and slammed the doors. I sat there, soaked and shaking, and locked all the doors. I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat and listened. Somewhere up the ridge, I heard something move. It was faint. Maybe a branch cracking, maybe just my brain inventing things. But I didn't wait to find out. I drove down that muddy road faster than I should have, wheels skidding in spots, windshield wipers smearing dirt and water. I didn't stop until I was back on pavement, heading south toward the nearest town. I ended up checking into a cheap motel outside Jasper that night. Everything in the room smelled like mildew, but I didn't care. I peeled off my wet clothes, sat on the bed in silence, and stared at the wall for over an hour. That night, I slept with the lights on. I never did go back to Hemlock Ridge. I never reported what I saw. There wasn't anything illegal about it, not really. Maybe someone had been hunting. Maybe they'd set up that blind and just forgotten about it. But the fresh boot print in the mud, the metal tapping sound in the storm, the feeling of being watched, it didn't feel like coincidence. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone, never off trail, and never without a way to leave quickly. Whatever or whoever was up on that ridge that night didn't make a move. They didn't hurt me, they didn't take anything, but they were there. I know they were, and I still wonder sometimes if I hadn't heard that sound, if I hadn't checked, if I'd stayed one more night, would I have made it out at all? I was 32 when I decided to take a break from everything and go camping alone in Tennessee. It was late October of 2017. The weather had just started to turn cold, but not enough to keep people from going outside. I had recently left my job at a logistics company in Pittsburgh after years of feeling boxed in by fluorescent lights and pointless meetings. I didn't tell anyone except my sister that I was leaving town. I just packed my gear, loaded up my old gray Toyota Tacoma, and headed south. I didn't plan every detail of the trip. I just knew I wanted solitude, real quiet, somewhere off the grid but not so remote I'd end up in trouble with no way out. I did a lot of online searching and settled on a section of land near Bear Ridge, not far from the Cherokee National Forest. It wasn't an official campsite. It was one of those old Forest Service roads that cuts deep into the mountains and then just ends. The kind you could miss if you blinked while driving. I found it on a forum about dispersed camping. Some guy had posted GPS coordinates and said he'd spend a weekend there alone and didn't see another soul. That sounded perfect to me. The drive down was long. I took I-81 through Virginia and dropped into Tennessee just past Bristol. I stopped at a gas station and filled up the truck. I bought a bag of beef jerky, a few gallons of water, and a can of bear spray just to be safe. I already had my tent, sleeping bag, food, propane stove, a hand crank radio, and a Ruger LCR .38 I kept in a side holster in my bag. Not because I expected anything to happen, but because I believed in being prepared. The turnoff to the forest road came after about 3 hours of winding back roads. It wasn't marked. There was just a wooden post that had been sawed off halfway, splinters sticking up like old bone. I turned in, checked my tires on the gravel, and followed the road until the trees got dense and the sun started to break through less and less. It felt like I was entering a tunnel of green and gray. Eventually, the road just stopped. It opened into a clearing surrounded by trees on all sides. To my right, maybe 50 yards away, I noticed the steep edge of a ravine. It dropped sharply, probably 200 feet or more. I couldn't see the bottom, but I could hear water way down there if I listened long enough. A fast stream or river, maybe. That's where I decided to set up. I parked the truck to face outward in case I needed to leave quickly. I set up my tent about 20 feet from the edge of the ravine and dragged over a few large stones to make a fire ring. I collected dry sticks, checked them for insects, and started a small fire. I boiled some water, made instant noodles, and sat on a stump I found half buried in pine needles. The air was crisp, clean, and just cold enough that it kept you awake. The trees were tall, older than anything I'd seen back in Pennsylvania. Oaks, sycamores, and hickories packed close, their leaves already halfway fallen. I spent the first night just soaking it all in. It was quiet the way only deep woods are. You hear everything out there, not just the owls or the occasional rustle in the leaves. but the distant groans of trees moving in the wind, the sharp cracking of branches falling, the sound of insects still buzzing even in the cold. I didn't sleep much that first night. I lay in my tent, listening, making mental notes of every sound and which direction it came from. I'm not usually jumpy, but there's something about being out there alone, far from cell service and lights, that sharpens you. Every small noise makes your brain guess at possibilities. The second day, I took a long hike down a trail that curved behind the ravine and looped through some dense forest. I brought my compass and checked it frequently, but the trail was pretty easy to follow. I didn't see anyone else, not even signs of other hikers. No wrappers, no cigarette butts, no old footprints. That was both comforting and unsettling. On the way back, around 3 in the afternoon, I saw something strange. About a mile from my camp, I noticed an old trail that branched off from the main one. It wasn't obvious unless you were really looking. The leaves and brush had mostly covered it, but you could still see where the earth had been packed down long ago. Curiosity got the best of me, so I followed it. It led to an old wooden structure, just a small shack, maybe 10 by 12 feet. The wood was weathered to the point where it looked gray and brittle. No windows, just a door hanging sideways on one hinge. There were metal barrels outside, rusted and half sunk into the soil. One had holes drilled in the side like it had been used as a burn barrel. A pile of bones, maybe animal, deer or raccoon, was scattered near it. Some clean, some not. That made my stomach tighten. I'm no stranger to nature. I've hunted. I've field-dressed deer. But this didn't feel like that. The cuts weren't clean. Some bones had dried sinew and fur still clinging to them. One still had a bit of rope around the joint. I didn't go inside the shack. I didn't even get close. I took a quick look, turned around, and followed my trail back. I didn't run, but I walked fast. My heart thumped the whole time, and I kept looking over my shoulder. Nothing followed me, no sounds, just that heavy silence. I reached camp around 5, and by then the sun was already low. I didn't cook that night. I just drank some water and sat near the fire with my jacket zipped up to my chin, bear spray in one hand, the gun closer than usual. That night I barely slept. Around 1 a.m., I heard something. Not a rustle or a crack, but a thump. Heavy, like a footstep on soft ground. Then silence. Another thump. Closer. I sat up in my sleeping bag, completely still. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't turn on my flashlight. I just sat, breathing through my nose, listening. After maybe 30 seconds of silence, I heard something move again. But this time, it wasn't a thump. It was the unmistakable sound of fabric scraping, like a bag being dragged. Then a low metallic clink. I didn't move. I waited over an hour before I dared to peek outside. When I finally did, I didn't see anything. The fire had long since gone out. My truck was there, my gear undisturbed. But near the fire ring, something was different. A trail. A faint drag mark in the pine needles and dirt, maybe a foot wide, leading from the direction of the woods to the fire pit, and then stopping. It didn't go back. I spent the next day deciding if I should leave. I felt watched. I felt like something had changed the moment I found that shack. But I told myself I was being paranoid. I convinced myself that it was an animal, or maybe a hunter who had stumbled into the wrong clearing. Maybe they saw the fire, got curious, and left. I told myself a lot of things. That afternoon, I went down near the ravine's edge, thinking about moving the tent farther back. That's when I saw it. Something shiny, wedged between 2 rocks halfway down the slope. I used my small binoculars to check. It was a metal canister like an old thermos. I didn't recognize it. It wasn't mine. I climbed down carefully, using roots and narrow ledges to keep from sliding. Took me about 20 minutes to reach the spot. When I got there, I saw that it wasn't a thermos at all. It was an old military-style container, olive green with a rusted latch. I pried it open. Inside were photos. Dozens of old Polaroids, most of them water damaged and faded. But a few were still legible. They were of people. Some looked posed. Others didn't. One showed a man sitting against a tree, hands behind his back, head slumped. Another was of a tent like mine, same shape, same color, taken from the tree line at night. The worst one was a photo of a campsite with a fire burning and a man lying just outside the tent flap. Not sleeping, his neck twisted at a bad angle. I felt cold all over. My mouth was dry. I put the photos back, closed the canister, and left it there. I didn't want to touch them again. I climbed back up, scraping my hands and knees more than once, and when I got back to camp, I packed everything. Fast. Tent, stove, bag, all of it shoved into the truck bed with no real order. I left the fire ring and the stacked stones. I didn't care anymore. I started the truck and drove back down that forest road, gravel kicking up behind me. I didn't stop until I hit pavement, and I didn't stop after that either. I drove all the way to a motel in Greenville, walked into the lobby covered in dirt and pine needles, and paid for a room in cash. I stayed there 2 nights before heading home. I never called the Rangers. I didn't report the shack. I didn't even tell my sister the full story. Just said I got spooked and left early. I know that's probably not the right thing to do, but something in me felt like I wasn't supposed to have seen any of it. Like I'd stumbled into something meant to stay buried. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still think about those photos sometimes. I wonder who took them. I wonder how long they'd been down there, sitting in that canister halfway down the ravine. I wonder who else found that shack and what they saw or didn't see. Every so often, I check forums about that area. I look up missing persons in Tennessee. I haven't found anything that connects directly, but I've seen new posts about Bear Ridge. People still go there. Some say it's peaceful. Some say they heard strange noises. One guy wrote that he found old bones and thought they might be human. I didn't comment. I've learned to leave some things alone. It was late October 2016 when I decided to do something strange and quiet with my weekend. I was 34 at the time, single, and had taken a few days off from my job doing plumbing repair work around southern Kentucky. I had been stressed. Too many calls, too many nights in cheap motels, too many arguments with angry landlords who didn't want to pay what they owed. I needed to unplug. I needed quiet. No people, no phones, no voices. Just open air and space. I had this idea that started as a joke when I was driving past a small cemetery about an hour north of Bowling Green. It sat right behind a church that hadn't been used in years. No glass in the windows. The wooden sign out front faded so badly the letters were unreadable. The place wasn't fenced, and it had no lights. The road next to it was narrow, empty, with just enough shoulder to park if you weren't picky. I remember thinking to myself, no one goes here, and the idea hit me like that. I could camp there. It sounded stupid at first, but the more I thought about it, the better it sounded. A graveyard was probably the most peaceful place I could pick. No kids.
No ateversus.
No campfires from teenagers. It was private, out of the way, and had enough trees around to stay hidden. I camped in worse places. Once behind a Walmart in Georgia. Another time under a bridge when I misjudged my route and had no daylight left. This was just another spot. More unusual. Sure, but no worse. I packed light. Just a tent, a sleeping bag, my heavy-duty flashlight, a small cooler with some water and sandwiches, and a camping knife I always kept on me. I left my phone in the glove box. I didn't want texts or social media. I didn't even tell anyone where I was going. That part wasn't smart, but I didn't care. I drove up there just before dark. The road was empty. That time of year, the leaves were already falling, covering the shoulder where I pulled over. I parked halfway into the brush, locked the truck, and grabbed my gear. The church was maybe 50 yards from the road, and the graveyard stretched behind it. Old headstones, scattered trees, and patches of grass that had gone yellow and dry. No path, no signs. I walked past the church, through the overgrown weeds, and picked a spot on the far edge of the cemetery. There was a broken-down chain-link fence back there, half covered by brush. It looked like someone had tried to mark the boundary once, but never finished. That whole section of the graveyard looked forgotten, like no one had touched it in decades. That was perfect. I set up the tent under a crooked tree. The roots were thick and stuck out of the ground like veins, so I had to clear a space just big enough for the tent to sit flat. I laid my sleeping bag out, stuck my knife in the soft earth beside me, and sat back on the edge of the tent flap with my sandwich and a bottle of water. The air was cool. Dead leaves shifted with every breeze. It was quiet, completely silent except for the sound of wind. That part was actually nice. For a while, I just sat there looking at the stones. Some of them were nothing more than square blocks, no names left to read. Others had worn carvings, mostly from the early 1900s. I saw one that said 1897. Another one, cracked down the center, had a child's name on it, only lived to age 4. That one got to me a little. The idea that someone buried a child out here more than 100 years ago, and now nobody remembered them.
No flowers.
No visitors, just dry grass and dead leaves piling up every fall. Around 9 o'clock, I got in my tent and zipped it closed. The moonlight was bright enough that I didn't need a flashlight. It lit the canvas from outside with a soft silver glow. I lay there in my bag, head on a rolled-up hoodie, listening to the wind push through the trees. That first hour passed without much thought. My mind wandered. I kept telling myself this was exactly what I needed. No calls, no one asking where I was, just dirt, trees, and cold air. But right before I started to drift off, I heard something, like a light crunching noise in the brush. At first I ignored it, probably a raccoon or an armadillo. I'd heard those before, but it didn't go away. It was slow, step by step, then silence, then another step. Not a scurry, not the kind of sound animals make. This was deliberate, even. I unzipped the tent just an inch and looked out. The wind had died down. The leaves weren't moving. I didn't see anything at first, but as my eyes adjusted, I noticed a shape, small, low to the ground, just past the broken fence near the tree line. It wasn't moving, just crouched there. I stayed still. My hand found the knife. After maybe 10 seconds, the shape turned and moved away. No sound, no panic, just disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I sat upright in the tent with the knife across my lap until the first light hit the sky. Every sound after that made me freeze. A branch falling, a breeze pushing leaves. I must have held my breath for hours. I kept telling myself it was just an animal, probably a deer or maybe a dog. The way it crouched didn't make sense, but I couldn't explain it, and that made it worse. When morning came, I unzipped the tent, stepped out into the cold, and checked the spot where I saw it. The leaves were scattered, no prints that I could see. The broken fence was still there, bent in the same place, but now I noticed something else. Beyond the fence, where the trees thickened, there was a narrow trench, almost like an old path, dug shallow into the dirt. It curved around behind the church and disappeared into the woods. I'd missed it the night before. I followed it with my eyes, then walked a little closer. The path wasn't made by water or animals. It looked like someone had taken a shovel and scraped along the same route over and over. There were marks in the dirt, flat blade impressions. Not new, but not old either. And there were pieces of wood, thin planks, broken, splintered, mostly buried but still sticking out. I don't know why I did it, but I dropped to one knee and pulled at one of the boards. It was soft, half rotted, but I could see nails in it. The head of a rusty nail caught the light. Then I saw a second piece of wood angled, and a third. It was a box that had been buried and pulled out. Long, narrow, and empty. That was when the weight hit my stomach. It wasn't a shed. It wasn't garbage. It was a casket, a child-sized casket, torn open, dragged through the dirt. I backed away. My hands were shaking. Who the hell does something like that? And why here where no one visits? I didn't think twice. I walked straight back to the tent, grabbed my pack, stuffed everything in without folding it, and headed toward the truck. I kept checking the trees. Every second I was out there, I felt watched. It wasn't fear like a movie. It was worse. It was the kind where your body tightens and your instincts scream that you're not supposed to be there. When I reached the road, I saw something else. My truck, my goddamn truck, had mud streaks on the side that weren't there before. Not from driving, from fingers. 5 long streaks right down the passenger door, like someone had pressed a muddy hand there and slid it down slowly. I opened the door, heart racing, and checked the inside. Everything was where I left it. The glove box was untouched, but the dust on the driver's side mat was disturbed, like someone had sat in my seat and got out. There were boot marks, small, narrow. I left fast, slammed the door, turned the key, and drove down that road without looking back. For weeks after, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The shape, the casket, the trench, the muddy hand on the truck. It all made sense in the worst way. Someone had been coming there at night, digging, opening old graves. For what reason, I didn't know, but it wasn't curiosity. It was something dark, quiet, wrong. I never called the police. I thought about it, but what would I say? That I camped illegally in a graveyard and saw a shadow? That I dug up part of a buried casket and ran away? They wouldn't take it seriously. Maybe they'd find me. Maybe they'd send someone out, find nothing, and move on. But I know what I saw. I know I wasn't alone out there. And I know someone used that graveyard for something no one should. That's why I never went back. Now it's been almost 10 years. I still think about it sometimes, especially at night. Every once in a while, I'll have a dream where I'm back in that tent, staring out the flap, and the shape isn't in the distance anymore. It's standing right in front of me. Not a monster, not a ghost, just a man, a real man, watching, waiting, covered in dirt. I always wake up sweating, and I never camp near graveyards anymore, ever.